My mother convinced my kids to ask for their custody transferred to her, promising video games, cell phones, and no rules. When I lost custody, she put them in a boarding school and disappeared. Irene's cell phone pointed directly at my children's faces while they mechanically recited a list of complaints about my parenting that had obviously been planted systematically during months of private conversations that I had naively allowed, thinking that the relationship between grandmother and grandchildren was healthy and beneficial, instead of being a training ground for emotional manipulation designed to destroy the maternal authority that I had carefully built through 14 years of dedicated parenting, balancing unconditional love with appropriate discipline necessary for healthy development of functional children, capable of navigating a complex world full of responsibilities and consequences, was the image that greeted me on a gray Thursday afternoon when I arrived 20 minutes earlier than usual, hoping to pleasantly surprise my children with news that I had finally gotten a promotion at work, meaning more financial stability for our family. My 37 years of existence built on foundations of tireless work as a human resources manager at a technology company, a marriage that survived financial and emotional storms through 12 years of mutual commitment with Daniel, and especially on the unshakable certainty that I knew my own children deeply and understood their emotional needs better than anyone else in the world, crumbled instantly when I perceived the artificial coldness in Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael's expressions as they pronounced words that clearly weren't their own, but rather a carefully crafted script by Irene during months of privileged access that I had generously granted, believing that a loving grandmother offering to help with childcare after school, while Daniel and I worked long hours, was a family blessing instead of being an infiltration strategy designed to systematically undermine my parental authority through constant comparisons between my supposed severity and her unlimited generosity. The scene unfolding in the living room had the surreal quality of a waking nightmare, where each word pronounced by my children pierced my heart like sharp knives coated with psychological poison that Irene had patiently distilled during countless afternoons supervising homework, preparing elaborate snacks that contrasted with my quick and practical meals dictated by time limitations, and especially whispering narratives about how life would be infinitely better, living with grandmother who truly understood the needs of modern children instead of an old-fashioned mother stuck in rigid mentality about bedtimes, limited screen time, and especially about the absurd need to complete household chores and maintain school responsibilities before enjoying entertainment privileges. Mom, we've talked a lot and decided we want to live with Grandma Irene because she understands us better and doesn't invent unnecessary rules that only serve to make our lives miserable for no reason, Gabriel announced with a voice trying to sound mature and decisive, but carrying a rehearsed tone, revealing that those specific words had been practiced repeatedly until perfectly memorized like lines from a theatrical play where he performed the role of an oppressed teenager seeking liberation from imaginary maternal tyranny. Julia nodded vigorously beside her older brother, adding with artificial enthusiasm, "Grandma said if we live with her, we'll get new video games, latest generation cell phones, and especially we won't have to do boring chores or follow ridiculous bedtime schedules when we're not even tired." Raphael, my youngest son of only 9 years, who was normally a cheerful and spontaneous child, incapable of hiding genuine emotions behind elaborate social masks, remained seated between his older siblings with a confused expression, suggesting less conviction about that collective declaration, but simultaneously social pressure to maintain solidarity with Gabriel and Julia, who had clearly been more intensively worked on by Irene during progressive psychological manipulation. The absolute silence that followed those impossible declarations was broken only by the sound of video recording from Irene's cell phone, meticulously capturing every nuance of my shocked expression, while she observed with disturbing satisfaction, my confusion rapidly transforming into growing horror as I comprehended the extent of family betrayal systematically orchestrated by my own mother against my innocent children who had been manipulated to believe that reasonable parental authority constituted abuse, justifying dramatic rebellion. Gabriel, Julia, Raphael, do you really believe that rules about bedtimes, limited screen time, and responsibility to complete school and household tasks before entertainment are unnecessary and cruel, instead of being manifestations of parental love designed to prepare you for functional adult life, where nobody receives rewards without effort, nor will have unlimited freedom without consequences? I managed to articulate with a controlled voice, despite my heart progressively shattering, as I realized my own children had been systematically alienated against me through months of psychological manipulation that I had naively not identified until that devastating moment of public confrontation deliberately orchestrated by Irene for maximum emotional impact, while documenting everything on video, obviously planning to use that recording later as distorted evidence in future judicial processes about custody. Irene finally intervened with theatrically compassionate voice that masked underlying calculated malice. Camilla, these children deserve to be heard about their housing preferences, instead of being forced to continue living under authoritarian regime that suffocates their healthy development through unnecessary restrictions based on your neurotic need for absolute control instead of genuine love that prioritizes children's happiness above arbitrary imposition of excessive discipline. Irene's words were carefully constructed to sound reasonable for potential external audience, including family court judges who would watch that recording later, while simultaneously reinforcing narratives she had systematically planted in my children's minds during months of progressive indoctrination, transforming normal and healthy parenting practices into evidence of emotional abuse, justifying intervention by a rescuing grandmother. The feeling of being trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare where objective reality had been completely inverted through sophisticated linguistic manipulation was absolutely suffocating and paralyzing. My own mother had crafted a complex conspiracy designed to steal custody of my children. Not because she genuinely believed I was an inadequate mother, but apparently because she desired control over grandchildren she saw as a second chance at motherhood, or perhaps simply because she enjoyed the power of manipulating complex family situations, demonstrating superiority over an adult daughter who had established independent life beyond her direct influence. During years of apparently functional relationship between Irene and my nuclear family, I had never perceived signs of underlying resentment about my parental autonomy, or especially about the fact that I had chosen childhood rearing approaches different from those she had employed with me during childhood, marked by emotional neglect, disguised as generous freedom, and especially by absence of consistent structure that left deep psychological scars that I spent decades in therapy trying to heal. Irene, you deliberately manipulated my children for months, making impossible promises about life without responsibilities, and especially painting a distorted portrait of me as a cruel mother instead of a dedicated mother, trying to raise functional children capable of navigating a real world full of challenges and consequences. Yun Mao, I declared with growing firmness while trying to control fury that threatened to explode into more intense verbal confrontation that would only serve Irene's manipulative purposes of portraying me as an unstable and aggressive person, incapable of controlling emotions appropriately in front of impressionable children. You are destroying the relationship between me and my children through systematic parental alienation that is legally recognized as a form of child psychological abuse. And you're doing all this while filming to create distorted evidence you plan to use in court to steal custody based on fabricated narratives instead of objective reality about my dedicated and loving parenting. Gabriel reacted defensively to that accusation against the grandmother who had strategically positioned herself as his ally against maternal tyranny. Mom, Grandma isn't manipulating anyone. She's simply offering us a choice about where we want to live and is willing to give us a better life without all the unnecessary rules you impose just because you like to control every aspect of our lives. Gabriel's words echoed perfectly the phraseology that Irene had obviously planted repeatedly during private conversations, transforming a 14-year-old teenager who was naturally testing parental limits into an unwitting ally of an alienation campaign, orchestrated by a manipulative grandmother who cynically exploited normal developmental vulnerabilities for her own obscure purposes. Julia added with growing conviction, fed by months of indoctrination. Grandma Irene said when we're old enough we can choose who we want to live with, and we all chose her because she really cares about our happiness instead of just wanting us to be obedient robots following orders without questioning. The mention of legal age for children to express custody preferences in family courts revealed that Irene wasn't simply making empty promises to gain temporary affection from grandchildren, but rather was executing a calculated legal strategy designed to use filmed statements from children as substantial evidence in future judicial processes. She was apparently already planning to formally initiate with support from an attorney specialized in grandparent custody cases. The devastating understanding that I was facing not simply a passing family conflict, but rather a coordinated legal attack designed to permanently remove my parental rights through a judicial system that frequently prioritized children's statements without adequate context about underlying psychological manipulation that shaped those expressed preferences, was absolutely terrifying in its enormity. How could I prove in court that my children had been systematically alienated against me through months of calculated manipulation instead of genuinely being unhappy living under my parental authority? How could I objectively demonstrate that rules about schedules, responsibilities, and screen time were manifestations of responsible parental love instead of arbitrary tyranny, when confronted with 3 children emotionally testifying they preferred living with grandmother, who promised unlimited freedom. Children, you need to understand that responsible adults don't make promises about life without rules or responsibilities, because such promises are lies designed to manipulate you temporarily until they get what they want. And then reality will inevitably be very different from the fantasy that was sold during the seduction process. So, I tried to explain with a voice oscillating between maternal firmness and growing desperation, realizing that rational words probably wouldn't penetrate layers of psychological conditioning that Irene had methodically built. Grandma Irene is doing exactly what a dishonest salesperson would do, promising miraculous product without mentioning inevitable defects that will be discovered only after purchase is finalized, and it's too late to reverse decision based on incomplete and deliberately misleading information. Irene responded immediately with theatrical indignation perfectly calibrated for video recording. Camilla, you're comparing me to a dishonest salesperson simply because I'm offering my grandchildren a loving environment where they'll be valued and respected instead of controlled through excessive discipline that reflects your own insecurities and neurotic needs for absolute domination over children who deserve appropriate autonomy for healthy development. Irene's skillful reframing transformed my attempts to explain manipulation into additional evidence of controlling behavior, and especially disrespectful toward her, as more experienced maternal figure supposedly offering generational wisdom about superior child-rearing. Daniel finally arrived home from work, entering through the front door, and immediately perceiving palpable tension dominating the living room where family confrontation was unfolding with his 3 children, seated formally beside mother-in-law, while wife remained standing visibly distressed before that impossible scene. What's happening here? Why does everyone seem so tense, and especially why is Irene filming? Daniel asked with growing confusion as he walked near me, placing a protective hand on my trembling shoulder. Before I could explain the devastating situation, Gabriel responded with a voice mixing teenage rebellion with underlying vulnerability. Dad, we were explaining to Mom that we want to live with Grandma Irene because she treats us better and doesn't invent unnecessary rules that only serve to make our lives miserable without valid reason. Daniel's expression changed rapidly from confusion to shocked understanding as he processed implications of that impossible declaration, and especially noticing Irene deliberately filming every family interaction as if documenting evidence for future judicial process. Irene, what have you done? Did you spend months manipulating our children against us, promising fantasy life without responsibilities to convince them to request custody with you in family court? Daniel confronted directly with controlled fury, characteristic of normally calm man, being forced to defend family against external threat, who should be ally instead of adversary. Irene turned off video recording, apparently deciding she had captured sufficient material for her purposes, and responded with calculated calm. Daniel, I simply offered my grandchildren choice about living environment, and they clearly expressed preference for living with me. This isn't manipulation, but rather respecting children's autonomy, and especially recognizing when parents aren't adequately meeting emotional needs of children who deserve better. The weeks following that impossible confrontation in the living room were bureaucratic and emotional nightmare of endless judicial battles, where Irene formally petitioned custody of my 3 children, presenting as main evidence that edited video recording showing children declaring preference for living with generous grandmother instead of supposedly controlling mother, complemented by elaborate letters supposedly written by the children themselves, but obviously containing vocabulary and sophisticated arguments beyond Gabriel. Julia and Raphael's capabilities revealing substantial adult assistance in composing those documents presented as authentic children's testimonies. Daniel and I hired Marcelo, attorney specialized in family law with decades of experience navigating complex parental alienation cases, who immediately recognized classic patterns of psychological manipulation in children's statements, and especially in tactics employed by Irene during months of privileged access to grandchildren that she had systematically exploited to undermine parental authority. Camilla, Daniel, the situation you described clearly constitutes severe parental alienation, where Irene deliberately manipulated vulnerable children through impossible promises, and especially through systematic denigration of you as parents to create artificial preference for custody with grandmother who positions herself as savior, liberating grandchildren from imaginary parental tyranny. Marcelo analyzed during first consultation in office, decorated with legal diplomas and especially shelves filled with jurisprudence precedents about complex family cases. Crucial challenge we face is that family courts frequently take very seriously preferences expressed by children above 10 years old, presuming adolescents possess capacity to form independent opinions about living environments, without adequately considering possibility that those preferences were artificially molded through sophisticated psychological manipulation executed by ill-intentioned adults. Marcello recommended immediately requesting complete forensic psychological evaluation of entire family, including Irene, to objectively identify patterns of parental alienation, and especially to document psychological damages that manipulation had caused in Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael, who were being cynically exploited as pawns in custody, war orchestrated by grandmother who apparently prioritized control over grandchildren above their emotional well-being. Dr. Regina was designated by court as forensic psychologist responsible for conducting extensive individual interviews with each family member, observing interactions between parents and children in controlled environment, and especially applying standardized psychological tests to evaluate family functioning and identify signs of manipulation or alienation that could be distorting children's statements about custody preferences. During first session with Dr. Regina in neutral office equipped with toys, art materials, and especially recording cameras documenting each interaction for later analysis, I tried to explain with desperate clarity how apparently healthy relationship with my mother had secretly transformed into sabotage campaign designed to steal my children through months of psychological manipulation that I had naively not detected until explosive confrontation, where children mechanically recited planted complaints about my parenting. Dr. Regina remained professionally neutral during my narrative, occasionally asking technical questions about relationship history with Irene, family dynamics before current conflict, and especially about specific parenting practices that Irene had characterized as excessively controlling, justifying intervention by protective grandmother. Camilla, I need you to understand that my function as forensic psychologist isn't to determine who's lying or who's morally superior person, but rather to objectively evaluate which custody environment would best serve children's interests based on psychological evidence instead of conflicting allegations from adults competing for control. Dr. Regina explained with that characteristic combination of clinical professionalism and limited human compassion, appropriate for judicial evaluation context. During coming weeks, I'll conduct separate interviews with Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael using specialized techniques designed to identify whether preferences expressed for custody with grandmother represent genuine desires based on independent evaluations of parental environments, or were artificially induced through psychological manipulation that exploited normal developmental vulnerabilities. The psychological evaluation sessions were emotionally devastating experiences, where I watched through one-way mirror my own children being gently questioned by trained professional about family relationships, and especially observed with growing horror how Gabrielle and Julia repeated narratives about my supposed excessive rigidity using sophisticated phraseology that had obviously been planted by Irene during months of progressive indoctrination. Raphael, younger and less completely indoctrinated, demonstrated visible ambivalence during interviews, occasionally expressing missing previous family routines, but quickly correcting himself to maintain solidarity with older siblings who had established unified position about preference for living with grandmother who promised freedom from boring responsibilities. Dr. Regina, when you observe children during your interviews, can you identify signs that their statements were rehearsed or manipulated instead of being authentic expressions of genuine feelings about family relationships? I asked anxiously after a particularly painful session where Julia had described detailed list of complaints about my parenting practices that were so articulated and consistent with Irene's narratives that obviously couldn't have been independently formulated by a 12-year-old girl. Dr. Regina considered my question carefully before responding with appropriate professional caution. I can say there are certain linguistic patterns and especially inconsistencies between spontaneous body language and rehearsed verbal content that raise questions about authenticity of some statements, but I need to complete full evaluation, including interviews with Irene and observations of interactions between grandmother and grandchildren, before forming definitive conclusions about extent of possible psychological manipulation. The evaluation session with Irene was particularly revealing when Dr. Regina subtly confronted her about specific promises made to grandchildren about life without rules or responsibilities if custody were transferred to her, and especially about discrepancy between idealized portraits she had painted during months of manipulation versus practical reality that 63-year-old woman working full-time couldn't realistically provide constant supervision or unlimited financial resources necessary to fulfill all extravagant promises about video games, cell phones, and absolute freedom. Irene responded with combination of defensiveness and strategic reframing, claiming she had been misinterpreted and that obviously there would be reasonable rules in her house, but they would be implemented with more flexibility and understanding than authoritarian regime she characterized my parenting practices. 2 weeks after completion of extensive psychological evaluations, Dr. Regina submitted detailed report to court concluding that although she couldn't conclusively prove intentional manipulation sufficiently severe to characterize criminal parental alienation, there were substantial concerns about inappropriate influence Irene had exercised over grandchildren through unrealistic promises, and especially through consistent denigration of me and Daniel as parents that had created false expectations in children about how life would be dramatically better under grandmother's custody. Crucially, report also identified that Gabriel and Julia demonstrated signs of internal emotional conflict between natural loyalty to parents versus alternative narratives planted by grandmother, suggesting expressed preferences weren't as firm or independent as they appeared superficially. Unfortunately for us, family court decided that despite concerns about Irene's influence, clear and consistent statements from 3 children expressing preference for living with grandmother couldn't be ignored without definitive evidence of criminal manipulation that exceeded limits of normal family involvement between grandparents and grandchildren. Judge Maria Santos, 58-year-old woman with reputation for prioritizing children's voices in custody decisions, declared in formal hearing that although she recognized legitimate parental concerns about Irene's motivations, and especially about realism of promises made during process of courting children's preferences, fundamental legal principle established that children above 12 years had significant right to express preferences about living environments, and that court should respect those preferences, absent clear evidence of immediate danger, justifying overriding of expressed desires. The judicial decision transferring primary custody of Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael to Irene with limited supervised visitation for me, and Daniel was pronounced on a cold afternoon that marked definitive end of my family life, as I had known it during 14 years of dedicated motherhood, replaced by bureaucratic nightmare where my own children were legally removed from my home based on artificially induced preferences through psychological manipulation that judicial system recognized existed, but judged insufficiently severe to completely invalidate desires expressed by children. Daniel held my hand firmly as we sat in stunned silence, processing impossibility of that sentence that transformed victims of parental alienation into perpetrators of tyranny, justifying removal of parental rights through systems supposedly designed to protect children, but in that specific case was inadvertently facilitating psychological abuse by validating manipulative tactics of grandmother who cynically exploited legal vulnerabilities to steal grandchildren. The transition day when court officials supervised physical removal of my children from our family home to Irene's residence located in distant neighborhood was most traumatic experience of my entire life, surpassing even loss of my own parents in accident when I was 20 years old. Because in that case I was losing human beings I had created and nurtured since birth, not to inevitable death, but rather to orchestrated legal manipulation that transformed parental love into crime, justifying forced separation between mother and children through coercive power of state mobilized by malicious grandmother. Gabriel avoided eye contact while packing belongings with help from impatient official wanting to complete uncomfortable transition quickly. Julia cried silently but refused goodbye hug, as if touching me represented betrayal to grandmother who had conquered her loyalty through months of systematic manipulation. And especially Raphael ran to me at last moment whispering he was scared but needed to go because older siblings said it would be better. The first weeks after loss of custody were a period of impossible mourning where I processed symbolic death of maternal relationship that had been center of my identity during decade and a half, replaced by artificial supervised visitations, where I met my children during 2 hours weekly in sterile office equipped with supervisor observing each interaction to guarantee I didn't try to manipulate children against Irene's custody, the same way she had manipulated against my custody without any institutional supervision during previous months. Gabriel maintained physical and emotional distance during visitations, conversing minimally about school and activities as if I were distant aunt instead of mother who had raised him since baby. Julia oscillated between defensive hostility and moments of vulnerability where she seemed to question decisions that had led to that impossible separation. And Raphael gradually became more withdrawn as weeks progressed without constant presence of parents who had provided structure and emotional security, replaced by unfulfilled promises from grandmother, who was quickly discovering that raising 3 children full-time was much more challenging than she had anticipated during idealized campaign to win custody. Approximately 2 months after custody transfer, I began noticing worrying changes in my children's behavior during supervised visitations, suggesting that Irene's extravagant promises about life without rules and unlimited freedom weren't materializing as expected. Gabriel casually mentioned he needed to complete household chores before playing video games, contradicting previous narratives about complete absence of responsibilities. Julia complained about bedtimes that apparently had been imposed by Irene despite promises about total flexibility. And especially Raphael expressed missing old family routines and repeatedly asked when he could come live with me again, revealing that fantasy of perfect life with grandmother was painfully colliding with less glamorous reality. I tried to carefully document those worrying changes, communicating observations to Marcelo, who was monitoring situation awaiting substantial evidence, justifying petition to modify custody order based on children's well-being deteriorating under Irene's care. The dramatic reversal that would eventually validate all my darkest concerns about Irene's true motivations came on a rainy Monday morning when I received urgent call from Marcelo, informing that Director Fernando from private boarding school located in distant city had contacted his office after discovering through administrative records that 3 recently enrolled children whose legal parents listed as deceased in admission documentation were actually my children who had been placed in that residential institution by Irene immediately after obtaining legal custody, and that she had subsequently disappeared completely without providing updated contact information or paying school tuitions that were rapidly accumulating, creating financial crisis that motivated administrative investigation, revealing documentary fraud, and especially child abandonment. The revelation that Irene had deliberately deceived judicial system competing for custody of my children, not because she genuinely desired to raise grandchildren, but rather because she had obscure plan to place them immediately in institutional boarding school and disappear, completely leaving vulnerable children abandoned in strange environment without family contact, was so shocking and incomprehensible that I initially refused to believe my own mother would be capable of cruelty so elaborate, and especially so completely devoid of any logic or apparent benefit for herself beyond perverse satisfaction of having destroyed my family life through complex legal manipulation. Marcelo explained that Director Fernando was deeply concerned with psychological well-being of Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael, who had arrived at boarding school confused about why grandmother, who had promised perfect life, suddenly had deposited them in residential institution, falsely claiming parents were dead, and she was only legal guardian unable to personally care due fabricated circumstances. Camilla, I need you to understand absolute gravity of this situation. Irene not only manipulated judicial system to obtain custody through parental alienation, but also committed multiple additional crimes including documentary fraud, abandonment of minors, and especially severe psychological abuse of children who were systematically deceived and then abandoned, creating emotional trauma that will require years of intensive therapy to heal, Marcelo explained with growing urgency. I'm immediately petitioning family court for emergency order restoring your complete custody based on irrefutable evidence that Irene obtained original custody through fraudulent pretenses about intentions to raise grandchildren, when in reality she was planning to abandon them institutionally. And simultaneously, I'm contacting criminal prosecutor to initiate formal investigation about multiple legal violations committed by your mother during this elaborate scheme of family abuse. The following hours were chaotic blur of urgent phone calls, preparation of emergency legal documentation, and especially desperate four-hour journey to distant boarding school where my abandoned children were being temporarily cared for by compassionate but increasingly concerned administrative staff about impossible situation of vulnerable children trapped in bureaucratic limbo. Daniel drove with excessive speed through highway while I sat in passenger seat, alternating between absolute fury directed against Irene, who had orchestrated that elaborate family tragedy, and especially growing relief that her true motivations had finally been exposed before she could cause even more severe emotional damages to my children through prolonged abandonment in institutional environment, where they were being treated as orphans without family instead of children, with desperate mother fighting tirelessly to recover custody, stolen through systematic manipulation of judicial system. When we finally arrived at boarding school located on extensive campus, surrounded by high walls creating disturbing institutional atmosphere, more like juvenile prison than welcoming educational environment, Director Fernando received us personally in formally decorated office, explaining in detail how Irene had appeared 3 weeks before with 3 visibly confused children, falsified documentation about parental death, and elaborate story about being elderly grandmother unable to personally care for orphaned grandchildren needing structured internal education that only residential institution could adequately provide. Director Fernando, I'm Camilla, legitimate mother of Gabriel, Julia and Raphael, who were illegally placed in this institution by my mother Irene using fraudulent documentation, falsely claiming me and my husband were dead, I managed to articulate with trembling voice oscillating between relief of finally having located my children after weeks of absolute anguish and growing fury directed against Irene, who had orchestrated that cruel institutional abandonment as culmination of elaborate family manipulation campaign. Fernando carefully examined legal documentation Marcelo had prepared, proving my identity as biological mother and legal guardian, comparing photographs on birth certificates with anxious faces of Daniel and me, standing before his administrative desk filled with bureaucratic papers. Mrs. Camilla, I need to express profound institutional apologies for having inadvertently facilitated this child abandonment through failure to adequately verify authenticity of documentation presented by Irene when she enrolled the children 3 weeks ago, Fernando declared with tone mixing professional embarrassment and genuine humanitarian concern about well-being of 3 children who had been deposited at institution under completely fraudulent pretenses. When Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael arrived here accompanied by your mother presenting falsified death certificates claiming parents had recently died in automobile accident, our administrative staff followed standard protocols verifying only superficial authenticity of documents instead of conducting deeper investigation that would have revealed obvious fraud. Fernando's explanation about how Irene had managed to deceive boarding school's administrative system through sophisticated falsified documentation, including fabricated death certificates with apparently authentic official stamps, revealed level of premeditation and elaboration of her scheme that transcended simple malicious impulse into territory of calculated conspiracy, methodically executed during weeks or possibly months of planning prior to judicial battle for custody. Daniel held my hand firmly as we processed devastating implications that Irene hadn't simply changed her mind after obtaining custody, but rather had planned from beginning to deposit children in boarding school and disappear completely as part of elaborate revenge designed to cause maximum possible psychological suffering. Director Fernando, where are my children now? Can I see them immediately? I asked with growing urgency, temporarily overcoming need to understand bureaucratic details about how Irene had executed documentary fraud in favor of overwhelming maternal impulse to embrace children. I had been forced to surrender to Irene's custody 2 months ago through judicial decision that now revealed itself to have been based on completely fraudulent pretenses about her intentions to personally raise grandchildren. Fernando nodded understandingly and immediately picked up internal phone calling residential department, where Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael were being temporarily housed while administration tried to resolve impossible situation of children abandoned by legal guardian who had subsequently disappeared without providing updated contact information. I'm requesting they bring Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael immediately to my office for emergency meeting with their biological parents who just arrived for resumption of legal custody. Fernando instructed staff member through phone line before hanging up and turning again to Daniel and me, with expression mixing professional compassion and apprehension about how children would react to reunion with parents after weeks of forced separation, and especially after having been deliberately deceived by Irene about parental death that never occurred. I need to warn you that Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael demonstrated significant signs of emotional trauma since arrival at boarding school 3 weeks ago, including severe social withdrawal, recurring nightmares, and especially persistent confusion about why grandmother who had promised perfect life suddenly abandoned them at institution, claiming parents were dead. Fernando's office door opened slowly, revealing middle-aged staff member accompanying 3 visibly emaciated and emotionally withdrawn children who looked like ghostly versions of vibrant children I knew before Irene began systematic campaign of family destruction. Gabriel entered first with defensively tense posture, characteristic of teenager forced to mature prematurely through traumatic experiences. His messy brown hair longer than I would normally allow, and especially his brown eyes demonstrating that quality of cautious distrust of child, who learned painfully that adults lie and abandon regardless of promises made. Julia followed behind older brother, firmly holding Raphael's hand, as if that physical contact were only anchor of security in world that had revealed itself to be much crueler and unpredictable than previous protected childhood had prepared her to navigate. The moment of recognition when Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael finally focused gazes on Daniel and me, standing anxiously near Fernando's desk, was simultaneously most devastating and most comforting of my entire life. Their expressions changing rapidly from confusion to absolute disbelief, and finally to cautious hope mixed with residual fear that parental apparition could be simply cruel hallucination, or worse yet, some additional trick elaborated by demonstrably untrustworthy adults. Raphael was first to break emotional paralysis, running through office and throwing himself into my open arms while sobbing uncontrollably, releasing weeks of repressed trauma through tears that soaked my blouse, while I held him protectively, repeatedly whispering that Mommy and Daddy were here now and would never again allow anyone to separate them. Gabriel and Julia remained standing near entrance, observing reunion between Raphael and parents with complex mixture of conflicting emotions, where obvious desire to run to comforting parental embraces fought against layers of psychological conditioning Irene had built during months of systematic manipulation, and especially against absolute confusion about how supposedly dead parents, according to grandmother's convincing claims, were now alive, standing in director's office requesting resumption of custody. Daniel walked slowly toward Gabriel and Julia, with hands extended non-threateningly, allowing older children to process that impossible reversal at their own pace, without forcing physical contact that could be emotionally overwhelming, considering recent trauma of abandonment and lies about parental death. Gabriel, Julia, I know you're confused about how Mommy and Daddy are here when Grandma Irene said we had died in accident. Daniel began with gentle voice calibrated to reassure traumatized children, instead of increasing anxiety through emotional confrontation too intense. Grandma lied about many things, including especially about our death, because she was sick in a way that affected her thoughts, making her believe things that weren't true. Mommy and I are alive, always loved you unconditionally, and spent recent weeks working tirelessly with lawyers to find you and bring you back home where you belong. Daniel's carefully chosen words tried to simultaneously validate children's legitimate confusion, explain Irene's incomprehensible behavior through lens of mental illness instead of pure malice, and especially reestablish our parental authority as trustworthy figures instead of perpetrators of additional abandonment. Julia finally broke tense silence with small voice loaded with vulnerability, contrasting dramatically with artificial confidence she had demonstrated during original confrontation in our living room when she mechanically recited complaints planted by Irene. Grandma said you had died and she was only family we had left, but she couldn't take care of us, so we needed to stay here at boarding school until we were old enough to take care of ourselves. She promised she'd visit every week but never came back after leaving us here on first day, and nobody could find her when we called phone number she had given. Julia's painful narrative revealed complete extent of Irene's cruelty, who had not only abandoned grandchildren at institution, but also deliberately cut all subsequent contact, leaving children completely isolated, without any family connection in strange environment populated by strangers. Gabriel finally allowed emotional defenses carefully constructed during weeks of institutional survival to partially fragment when his voice broke, asking directly, "Mom, Dad, are you really alive? Or is this some kind of cruel dream I'll wake up from and discover I'm still alone in this horrible place?" The devastating question revealed depth of psychological trauma that Irene's abandonment had caused, creating fundamental uncertainty about objective reality, where Gabriel could no longer trust his own sensory perceptions to distinguish between genuine experiences and potential hallucinations born from desperate desire for family reunion. I walked slowly toward Gabriel, opening arms in non-forced invitation, allowing him to decide if he was ready for physical contact that could offer tangible validation of our real presence. Gabriel hesitated only a moment before finally yielding to overwhelming impulse and walking quickly to parental embrace that had been denied during 2 months of forced separation. His adolescent arms wrapping around my body firmly, as if trying to convince himself through physical contact that impossible reunion was genuinely real instead of desperate fantasy. Julia followed older brother's example, joining collective embrace that quickly included Daniel and Raphael, creating reunified family circle in midst of sterile institutional office that temporarily represented safe refuge after weeks of traumatic separation, orchestrated by Irene's malicious manipulation. We remained embraced silently for several minutes while each family member individually processed enormity of that reunion moment that had seemed impossible just hours before, when we still believed locating children would require prolonged investigation instead of unexpected phone call from concerned boarding school director. Fernando discreetly allowed family reunion to unfold, without bureaucratic interruption, demonstrating human sensitivity, appropriate for emotionally charged situation, but eventually needed to gently intervene to discuss administrative procedures necessary for legal transfer of custody, back to Daniel and me, now that Irene's documentary fraud had been exposed through our personal appearance proving falsity of death certificates she had presented during original enrollment. Camilla, Daniel, although I deeply sympathize with emotional urgency of taking Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael home immediately. There are legal protocols we need to follow to appropriately document this custody transfer, and especially to guarantee situation is reported to appropriate authorities for criminal investigation about documentary fraud and child abandonment committed by Irene. Fernando explained with apologetic tone for necessity of injecting bureaucracy into emotionally overwhelming family reunion moment. Marcelo, who had accompanied us during journey to boarding school but remained discreetly in external corridor during initial reunion, entered office carrying folder filled with legal documentation prepared in advance to facilitate custody resumption process. Director Fernando: I brought all necessary documentation proving Camila and Daniel are biological parents and legitimate legal guardians of Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael, including original birth certificates, judicial orders establishing custody, and especially official statements from criminal prosecutor initiating formal investigation about multiple legal violations committed by Irene during execution of this elaborate scheme of documentary fraud and child abandonment. Marcelo presented professionally while distributing documents across Fernando's desk for administrative review. Can I take my children home now? I asked with growing impatience, overcoming intellectual appreciation for necessity of appropriate bureaucratic processes in favor of overwhelming maternal impulse to remove Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael from that institutional environment, representing only traumatic memories of abandonment, and especially to re-establish comforting family routines in our home, where children could begin long process of emotional recovery from months of psychological manipulation and weeks of institutional abandonment. Fernando nodded understandingly, but quickly warned about additional practical considerations. You certainly can take Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael home today, but I need to strongly recommend hiring psychologists specialized in childhood trauma to evaluate emotional impact of recent experiences and provide appropriate therapy that will help children process abandonment and especially rebuild trust in family relationships that was severely damaged through Irene's manipulations. Fernando's recommendation echoed exactly suggestions Marcelo had made during previous consultations about need for professional psychological support to help Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael navigate complex trauma of having been systematically alienated against parents through months of calculated manipulation, legally removed from safe family environment based on artificially induced preferences, and finally cruelly abandoned at institution based on lies about parental death that created additional layers of psychological damage on already fragile foundation of interpersonal trust. Daniel confirmed we already had pediatric psychologists specialized in trauma working with our children during period of custody with Irene, and we would resume therapeutic sessions immediately after return home. While Fernando prepared final release paperwork officially documenting custody transfer back to Daniel and me, I took opportunity to talk privately with Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael about what expectations they should have about family life after return home. Children, I know recent months have been absolutely devastating for you through Grandma Irene's manipulations that convinced you life would be better living with her, then abandoned you here saying Mommy and Daddy were dead. I began carefully choosing words that would validate their trauma without exposing excessively complex adult details. When we return home today, some things will be exactly as you remember from before going to live with Grandma, including your rooms, favorite toys, meal routines, and school schedules that provide comforting structure. But other things necessarily will be different because all of us, including Mommy and Daddy, were profoundly affected by forced separation, and will need to work together as family to rebuild trust, and especially to heal emotional wounds caused by everything that happened. Rafael asked with small voice loaded with residual anxiety, Mom, will Grandma Irene be able to take us away again? I'm afraid when we're home she'll appear and make more lies that convince judges to take us from you again. The question revealed that trauma of forced separation had created persistent fear about security of parental relationship, where Rafael could no longer take for granted that living with parents was permanent and stable arrangement. Marcelo intervened appropriately to respond to that legitimate concern with legal authority I didn't possess. Rafael, I can promise you Grandma Irene will never again have opportunity to take you or your siblings away from your parents because she's currently being criminally investigated for multiple serious violations, including documentary fraud, child abandonment, and especially for obtaining custody through fraudulent pretenses. Additionally, court already issued restraining order prohibiting any contact between Irene and you until she completes intensive psychiatric treatment and demonstrates she no longer represents risk to your emotional well-being. Marcelo's technical explanation about legal protections implemented to prevent future contact between Irene and children offered some reassurance, but Gabriel demonstrated residual skepticism characteristic of teenager who learned painfully that judicial system can be manipulated through convincing presentations instead of objective truths. But Grandma managed to convince judges it would be better living with her even when you tried to explain she was manipulating us. So how can we trust this time judges will really protect our family instead of believing more lies from her? Gabriel's astute observation about fallibility of judicial system that had been exploited by Irene during original custody battle revealed that traumatic experience had forced premature maturation, where he could no longer maintain childlike faith in adult authorities as infallible protectors of justice. Gabriel, you're absolutely correct that judicial system made grave error allowing Grandma Irene to obtain custody based on manipulations courts didn't adequately identify. I acknowledged honestly validating his legitimate skepticism instead of trying to restore naive trust in authorities through empty promises. But this time situation is fundamentally different because Irene exposed her own fraudulent intentions through her actions of abandoning you at boarding school, using falsified documentation about Mommy and Daddy's death. There's no interpretive ambiguity about whether her behavior was appropriate or not. She committed clear and documented crimes that will result in definitive legal consequences instead of simply conflicting opinions about which custody environment would be better for your emotional well-being. The explanation tried to demonstrate crucial difference between original custody battle where Irene had manipulated children's expressed preferences to create ambiguous case versus current situation where documentary fraud and abandonment were unequivocal violations without possibility of alternative interpretation favorable to her. Julia demonstrated different concern when she asked hesitantly, "Mom, is Grandma Irene sick like Dad said? Will she get better or will she always be dangerous to us?" The question revealed that despite all trauma caused by Irene's manipulations and abandonment, Julia still maintained some residual affection for grandmother, who had spent months cultivating relationship through generous promises and focused attention before revealing true intentions through cruel institutional abandonment. Navigating that emotional complexity where children needed to simultaneously process betrayal by family figure who should protect them while potentially keeping door open for eventual reconciliation, if Irene demonstrated genuine recovery through psychiatric treatment was devastating parental challenge without simple answers that would completely satisfy conflicting needs for justice and compassion. Julia, Grandma Irene is being evaluated by doctors specialized in problems affecting people's thoughts and emotions, and these professionals will determine whether her behavior was caused by illness that can be treated through medication and therapy or represents conscious choices she made independently of any medical condition. I explained carefully navigating between appropriate honesty and protection from excessively complex adult details. Regardless of specific diagnosis, most important thing you need to understand now is Grandma won't be allowed to have contact with you until and unless medical and legal team determines she no longer represents risk of causing additional emotional damages through future manipulations or abandonments. If eventually she demonstrates genuine recovery, and especially if you decide you want to try rebuilding relationship with her, that will be decision we make together as family, instead of being imposed through judicial orders or her manipulations. Fernando finally completed preparation of all documentation necessary for official release of Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael from institutional custody back to our parental guardianship, presenting forms for multiple signatures while explaining follow-up procedures boarding school would implement, including formal report to child protection authorities about fraud perpetrated by Irene, and especially recommendations for improvements in documentation verification protocols that would prevent similar future situations. I'd like to express again profound institutional apologies for having inadvertently facilitated abandonment of Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael through failure to detect Irene's documentary fraud. Fernando reiterated sincerely. Will immediately implement enhanced protocols requiring cross-verification of death certificates through official government databases before accepting enrollments based on orphanhood claims. The return journey home traversing same highway we had anxiously crossed few hours before was emotionally complex experience, where overwhelming relief of having recovered Gabriel, Julia, and Rafael mixed with apprehension about challenges we'd face during family reconstruction process after trauma of months of separation and manipulation. Children remained mostly silent in backseat of car, individually processing enormity of dramatic changes that had occurred during recent hours, transforming reality of institutional abandonment based on claimed orphanhood into impossible family reunion, revealing supposedly dead parents were alive, and fighting tirelessly to recover custody stolen through manipulative grandmother's fraud. Rafael eventually broke thoughtful silence, asking surprisingly practical question, considering recent emotional trauma. "Mom, are my toys still in my room? Or did Grandma Irene take everything away when she took us from home?" The question revealed that despite devastating recent experiences, Raphael maintained characteristic concerns of 9-year-old child focused on tangible possessions, representing continuity and security instead of being completely consumed by processing complex psychological traumas that inevitably would affect emotional development during future years. I smiled genuinely for first time in weeks, responding, "All your toys are exactly where you left them, Raphael. We kept your rooms completely untouched as sanctuaries waiting for day we'd finally bring you back home." Gabriel demonstrated more mature concern when he asked, "Mom, Dad, what's going to happen to Grandma Irene now? Will she go to prison for having abandoned us and lied about you being dead?" The question revealed that despite having been victim of Irene's manipulations and abandonment, Gabriel maintained sufficient human empathy to worry about consequences grandmother would face, even recognizing her actions had been profoundly harmful to his and siblings' emotional well-being. Daniel responded with appropriate honesty. "Gabriel, we don't know yet exactly what legal consequences Grandma Irene will face because criminal investigation is still in initial stages. But it'll probably involve combination of mandatory psychiatric treatment to address mental health problems that contributed to her behavior, and possibly some form of legal punishment for crimes of documentary fraud and child abandonment she committed." Julia asked with small voice loaded with residual guilt. "Mom, was it our fault Grandma managed to take us from you? If we hadn't told judges we wanted to live with her, none of this would have happened." The devastating question revealed Julia had internalized inappropriate responsibility for chain of traumatic events that had been orchestrated completely by Irene's calculated manipulations instead of representing genuine and independent choices by vulnerable children. I turned in front seat to make direct eye contact with Julia, while responding with emphasis, allowing no ambiguity. "Julia, listen very carefully because this is absolutely crucial you understand. Nothing that happened was your fault, or Gabriel's or Raphael's in any way. Grandma Irene manipulated you for months, making impossible promises and painting distorted portrait of Mommy and Daddy as bad parents to make you believe life would be better living with her. But you were vulnerable children, being systematically deceived by adult who should protect you instead of exploiting you for her malicious purposes." When we finally arrived at our family home located in quiet residential neighborhood that had been scene of original confrontation where Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael had mechanically recited complaints planted by Irene 2 months before, atmosphere was simultaneously comfortingly familiar and strangely altered through lens of recent traumatic experiences that had transformed each family member in ways we were still beginning to completely understand. Children slowly exited car observing house with mixture of nostalgia and apprehension, as if they couldn't completely trust that impossible return was genuinely permanent, instead of being temporary before next dramatic reversal that would tear them again from parental security. Raphael ran immediately to his room after entering through front door, anxiously verifying toys and decorations were exactly as he had left them 2 months ago, when forced to pack belongings under supervision of court officials executing custody transfer to Irene. His relief scream, confirming promise that nothing had been altered, was genuine, reverberated through house, bringing genuine smiles to Daniel's and my faces, for first time in weeks of anguish about whereabouts and well-being of our children. Gabriel and Julia moved more cautiously through familiar spaces as if visiting museum of previous lives instead of returning to homes where they unquestionably belonged. Daniel suggested we prepare children's favorite meal as celebration of family reunion, and especially as way to reestablish comforting routines that had been brutally interrupted through forced separation. While we worked together in kitchen preparing lasagna, Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael always loved. Conversations gradually flowed more naturally as children began relaxing defensive vigilance they had developed during weeks of hostile institutional environment where trusting adults had repeatedly proved to be painful mistake. Raphael shared details about boarding school routines, including rigid schedules of waking at 6 in morning, communal meals served in noisy cafeteria, and especially loneliness of sleeping in dormitory shared with strangers, instead of security of own room decorated with favorite posters and familiar toys. Julia described how she had initially tried making friendships with other children at boarding school, but quickly realized majority of students were troubled teenagers sent by desperate parents or genuinely orphaned children without families wanting them, creating displacement atmosphere where she and siblings didn't fit into any established social category within institutional hierarchy. Gabriel admitted he had assumed protective role over younger siblings during weeks at boarding school, intervening when other students tried to bully Raphael, or when Julia showed signs of emotional collapse during lonely nights, processing Irene's abandonment and supposed parental death. She had gradually begun internally questioning, despite lacking objective evidence contradicting narrative grandmother had convincingly planted. The family meal around dining table that had been scene of countless conversations during years prior to Irene's manipulation campaign was emotionally charged experience where each bite of lasagna symbolically represented restoration of normalcy, while everyone implicitly recognized previous innocence had been permanently lost through traumas that had cruelly exposed realities about adult fallibility, and especially about how close people, including family, can cause deep wounds through deliberately malicious choices disguised as legitimate concerns. Daniel proposed toast with juice glasses celebrating family reunion, and especially renewing commitment to protect Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael against any future threats regardless of family or external origin. After dinner, we established plan for next day that would include gradual return to school for Gabriel and Julia after 3-week absence that had been officially explained as family emergency, but inevitably had generated speculation among classmates and teachers about real nature of situation. Raphael still had one more week before resuming his school year, due to differences in calendars between educational levels, providing opportunity for more gradual reintegration through comforting domestic activities before facing social environment of classroom, where rumors about family probably had circulated widely during his prolonged absence. Gabriel expressed anxiety about returning to school and facing inevitable questions from classmates about where he had been during recent weeks, and especially about status of grandmother, who was known figure in community through years of participation in school events before revealing true manipulative nature. Marcelo had prepared official letter explaining Gabriel and Julia's absence through carefully calibrated language, validating genuine family emergency without exposing private details about Irene's fraud and institutional abandonment that weren't appropriate subject for public dissemination through informal school channels. School administration had been confidentially briefed about real situation and instructed to carefully monitor signs of bullying or discrimination directed against Gabriel and Julia, based on rumors about traumatic family circumstances. When bedtime finally arrived, Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael demonstrated understandable reluctance about separating to own individual rooms after weeks of shared dormitory at boarding school, where at least they had physical proximity to each other as comfort during lonely nights processing abandonment trauma. Daniel suggested temporary compromise where children could sleep on mattresses on floor of our master bedroom until feeling sufficiently secure to return to normal sleeping arrangements in own rooms, offering constant parental presence during vulnerable sleep hours when nightmares about abandonment and death frequently emerged as witnessed by boarding school staff reports about recurring nighttime disturbances Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael had experienced during weeks under institutional custody. The first night reunited as family after 2 months of traumatic separation was bittersweet experience, where overwhelming gratitude for recovery of Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael mixed with painful awareness of deep psychological wounds that would require years of therapy and especially patient reconstruction of trust that had been systematically destroyed through Irene's calculated manipulations, culminating in cruel institutional abandonment based on lies about parental death. Lying in darkness, listening to soft breathing of 3 children sleeping on nearby mattresses, demonstrating vulnerability they normally hid behind carefully constructed emotional defenses. I finally allowed tears of mixed relief and fury to silently flow while processing enormity of what Irene had perpetrated against own grandchildren, for motivations remaining obscure even after months of speculation about possible mental illness or influence of radicalized online groups. The morning following that first night reunited as family brought practical and emotional challenges I had intellectually anticipated, but revealed themselves much more complex when directly confronted through children's behaviors, demonstrating depth of psychological trauma caused by months of manipulation, followed by weeks of institutional abandonment. Gabriel woke before dawn, screaming from nightmare where Irene returned to take them again, claiming she had found new documents proving Daniel and I were imposters pretending to be their parents. Revealing physical reunion hadn't completely eliminated residual fears about permanence of restored family arrangements. Julia refused breakfast, claiming nausea that clearly had emotional rather than physical origin, sitting silently at table while pushing food around plate without making eye contact with Daniel or me, as if internally processing persistent guilt about her role in chain of events that had led to family separation. Raphael demonstrated excessive physical attachment, refusing to leave my proximity even for simple activities like using bathroom or playing in own room. Regressive behavior characteristic of child, whose fundamental security about parental figure's permanence had been severely compromised through traumatic abandonment by adult who should have protected him. The morning call to Dr. Isabella, pediatric psychologist who had briefly worked with children during initial period of custody with Irene before access was interrupted when Irene deposited them at boarding school, resulted in emergency scheduling for family session that same afternoon, where everyone could begin processing collective trauma through structured therapeutic environment. Isabella expressed significant concern about psychological impact of multiple layers of manipulation, forced separation, and especially abandonment based on lies about parental death that had created therapeutic challenges substantially more complex than typical parental alienation she normally treated in clinical practice. The revelation that Gabriel partially blamed Daniel and me for custody loss, even intellectually recognizing we had done everything possible within legal limits, was painful, but simultaneously understandable as trauma manifestation, where victims frequently redirect anger from main perpetrators to safer targets, not representing threat of additional abandonment. Dr. Isabella validated Gabriel's feelings while gently challenging cognitive distortions through Socratic questioning about objective evidence demonstrating Daniel and I had worked tirelessly during months trying to recover custody through appropriate legal channels instead of simply passively accepting court. Imposed separation. Julia expressed feelings through disturbing drawing, showing 3 small figures trapped behind bars, while 2 larger figures remained outside, reaching uselessly through bars. Powerful visual representation of how she had experienced separation as imprisonment, where parents were powerless to rescue her, despite physical proximity suggested by artistic composition. Drawing also revealed persistent guilt about her role in creating that prison, through filmed statements expressing preference for living with Irene, that had been used as evidence justifying custody transfer, eventually leading to institutional abandonment, represented by bars in her drawing. Raphael remained mostly silent during session, firmly holding my hand as physical anchor, while observing older siblings verbally processing shared traumas experienced individually through different developmental lenses appropriate for respective ages. When Dr. Isabella gently asked how he was feeling about returning home, Raphael simply whispered he was afraid of waking up discovering family reunion had been dream, and he was still alone in cold boarding school dormitory waiting for Grandma to fulfill promise of visiting him weekly that never materialized after first day of abandonment. Dr. Isabella explained to Daniel and me during private portion of session that complete recovery from such complex and multi-layered trauma would probably require years of regular therapy combined with substantial patience, while children gradually rebuilt fundamental trust in family relationships that had been systematically destroyed through calculated manipulations, followed by cruel abandonment. She recommended weekly individual sessions for each child, complemented by monthly family sessions, where everyone could collectively process dynamics emerging during reconstruction of family life after trauma, and especially warned we could expect behavioral regressions, emotional explosions apparently disproportional to minor triggers, and significant challenges in multiple areas, including school performance, peer relationships, and especially trust in adult authorities. The weeks following that first therapeutic session established new family normal, characterized by constant vigilance about children's emotional well-being, flexibility about behavioral expectations while they navigated healing process, and especially open communication about feelings and concerns instead of allowing resentments or fears to silently accumulate, creating additional emotional distance. Gabriel returned to school facing curious questions from classmates for which he had prepared brief, honest responses about family emergency, without entering into private details inappropriate for dissemination through adolescent social networks, but demonstrated difficulty concentrating on schoolwork due to persistent concerns about stability of restored family arrangements. Julia initially refused returning to school, claiming anxiety about facing classmates after prolonged absence, but after a week of gradual transition through half-days followed by full days with option to call home whenever feeling overwhelmed, she eventually reintegrated into school routines, maintaining surprisingly strong academic performance, considering recent emotional trauma. Teachers had been confidentially briefed about family situation and instructed to offer appropriate accommodations, including extensions on assignment deadlines, permission to leave classroom if anxiety became overwhelming, and especially vigilance about signs of bullying by classmates who might have heard rumors about unusual family circumstances. Approximately 6 weeks after recovery of Gabriel, Julia and Raphael from boarding school, Marcelo called me informing criminal investigation about Irene's activities had progressed substantially, revealing not only documentary fraud and child abandonment specifically related to my children, but also broader pattern of fraudulent behavior, including multiple false identities used to illegally obtain credit, false claims of terminal illnesses to solicit charitable fund donations, and especially participation in elaborate insurance fraud scheme being investigated by federal authorities independently of our family case. The revelation that Irene's criminal behavior transcended widely family manipulations to include sophisticated financial frauds suggested her motivations for stealing custody of my children were much more complex and especially more sinister than simply desire for control over grandchildren or revenge against daughter who had established autonomy. Marcelo explained prosecutors were building comprehensive criminal case against Irene that would probably result in multiple federal and state charges, carrying potential for decades of prison if convicted on all crimes being investigated, and especially that investigators had discovered Irene had disappeared completely after abandoning Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael at boarding school, using one of multiple false identities to flee, presumably trying to avoid legal consequences for crimes she had been systematically committing during years without detection, until abandonment of my children had finally attracted attention of authorities motivated to investigate deeply after exposure of such flagrant documentary fraud involving vulnerable children. The news that Irene remained fugitive created renewed anxiety in Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael, who had begun gradually relaxing defensive vigilance as weeks passed without any contact or threat from her. But revelation she was actively evading authorities reintroduced fear. She could eventually appear trying to recover contact with grandchildren, or worse yet, trying to cause additional damages through new manipulations or direct violence, motivated by anger about exposure of her crimes through investigations triggered by fraudulent custody case. Marcelo assured protection order remained in force prohibiting any contact between Irene and our family, and multiple law enforcement agencies were actively searching for her through arrest warrants related to federal and state crimes that widely transcended family custody issues. The dramatic reversal that finally brought conclusion to impossible saga with Irene came on cold winter afternoon, approximately 5 months after children's recovery from boarding school, when Marcelo urgently called informing Irene had been captured by federal authorities after unsuccessful attempt to cross international border using falsified passport, adding more federal criminal charges related to identity fraud and flight from justice to already extensive lists of crimes for which she was being prosecuted. The capture finally eliminated persistent anxiety about possible reappearance of her trying to cause additional damages to our family, and especially created opportunity to obtain definitive answers about motivations that had driven such bizarre and cruel behavior during elaborate family manipulation campaign. Marcelo explained that as part of plea bargaining negotiations designed to reduce potential decades in prison to more manageable sentence, Irene had agreed to submit to comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, and especially to participate in mediated sessions where she could explain motivations for behaviors that had caused so much suffering for family, including especially Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael, who had been cynically exploited as instruments in elaborate revenge against me for reasons still remaining obscure despite months of speculation. Decision about whether to participate in those mediated sessions was complex, because part of me desperately desired to understand why my own mother had chosen to deliberately destroy family through such cruel manipulations. But another part recognized any explanation Irene offered would probably be inadequate to justify trauma she had caused. After consulting extensively with Dr. Isabella about potential psychological impacts on Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael of confronting Irene in mediated environment, we decided Daniel and I would participate in initial session alone, while children continued regular therapy processing feelings about Irene's capture and possible eventual confrontation, if they decided they wanted opportunity to directly express to her impact her manipulations and abandonment had caused on their emotional well-being. The mediated session occurred in sterile conference room at correctional facility where Irene was detained awaiting trial, conducted by professional mediator trained in facilitating difficult communications between family members in severe conflict generally related to serious interpersonal crimes. Seeing Irene for first time since children's abandonment at boarding school approximately 6 months before was surreal experience where 63-year old woman seated across metal table wearing bright orange prison uniform appeared simultaneously familiar as mother I had known during decades, and completely strange as criminal who had systematically destroyed family through elaborate manipulations motivated by reasons still not completely understood. Irene avoided initial eye contact, maintaining gaze fixed on table, while mediator established basic rules for communication, including prohibition of interruptions, respectful language despite intense emotions, and especially focus on understanding instead of accusations or revenge-seeking that wouldn't serve sessions' therapeutic purposes. When mediator finally asked Irene directly if she was prepared to explain motivations behind behaviors that had led to that situation, she breathed deeply before beginning fragmented narrative, revealing during years she had nurtured growing resentment about fact I had established independent family life, and especially had chosen different parenting practices from those she had employed with me during childhood, interpreting those differences not as legitimate choices of autonomous adult, but rather as implicit judgment about her inadequacies as mother who had failed to provide appropriate structure and discipline during my own childhood, resulting in years of therapy, trying to heal damages from emotional neglect disguised as generous freedom. Irene's explanation revealed primary motivations had been toxic mixture of resentment about perceived judgment, desire to demonstrate superiority by proving she'd win grandchildren's loyalty through permissiveness instead of discipline, and especially when confronted with reality, that raising 3 children full-time was much more challenging than she had anticipated during idealized campaign to win custody. Anger directed against me for supposedly having made parenting seem easier than it really was through years of dedicated work she had superficially observed without fully appreciating underlying necessary effort. The admission she had abandoned Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael at boarding school, not because she genuinely believed it would be better for them, but rather because she didn't want to admit failure in managing to raise grandchildren after such elaborate campaign to steal custody was particularly disturbing in its emotional childishness. Irene, are you telling me you deliberately destroyed entire family through months of psychological manipulation against vulnerable children, fraudulently obtained custody through judicial system, and then abandoned your own grandchildren at boarding school based on lies about parental death, simply because you didn't want to admit you had overestimated your capacities to raise 3 children after years watching me make it seem easier than it really is? I asked with absolute disbelief about banality of motivations compared with enormity of damages caused. Irene finally made eye contact, responding with mixture of defensiveness and reluctant recognition. When you put it that way, it sounds absurd. But at the time, it seemed to make sense within situation's logic where I was trying to prove point about your parenting practices being unnecessarily rigid, and especially about you having implicitly judged me as inadequate mother by choosing to do everything different from how I did with you. The session continued for 2 hours, where Irene gradually revealed additional details about how she had been influenced by radicalized online groups promoting narratives about grandparents' rights being systematically denied by controlling adult children, how she had methodically planned parental alienation campaign during months before executing filmed confrontation in our living room, and especially how she had prepared falsified documentation about parental death weeks before judicial custody battle suggesting institutional abandonment had been planned from beginning instead of impulsive decision after discovering full-time parenting challenges. The revelations confirmed Irene had acted with substantial premeditation instead of simply reacting emotionally, making her crimes even more grave from legal and moral standpoint. When we finally exited that mediated session approximately 3 hours after beginning, I felt simultaneously relieved to have obtained definitive answers about Irene's motivations, and profoundly disturbed by banality of those motivations compared with devastating trauma she had caused in Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael, who would take years fully recovering from manipulations and abandonment, orchestrated simply because resentful grandmother wanted to prove point about parenting practices instead of having any genuine concern about their emotional well-being. Daniel held my hand firmly as we silently processed revelations during return trip home, both recognizing that although understanding of motivations offered some intellectual closure, it didn't eliminate emotional damages already caused nor facilitated forgiveness process we probably would never completely achieve. During following therapeutic session, I shared with Dr. Isabella Irene's revelations about motivations, and together we discussed whether it would be therapeutically beneficial or harmful to share that information with Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael, considering their ages and emotional processing capacities. Isabella recommended sharing developmentally appropriate simplified version focusing on fact. Irene's behavior had been motivated by her own problems, instead of any children's failure or inadequacy, and especially that her crimes had resulted in definitive legal consequences guaranteeing she'd never again have opportunity to cause additional damages through future manipulations or abandonments. Approximately 8 months after children's recovery from boarding school, Irene formally pled guilty to multiple federal and state charges, including documentary fraud, child abandonment, fraudulent custody obtainment, identity fraud, and flight from justice in exchange for negotiated sentence of 15 years prison, with possibility of parole after serving at least 85% of sentence. As part of plea agreement, Irene permanently renounced all parental rights or visitations related to Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael, and agreed to have no direct or indirect contact with our family during sentence fulfillment, and especially during any subsequent parole period. The legal finality of that agreement offered definitive closure, eliminating any residual anxiety about possible future reappearance of Irene trying to rebuild relationships with grandchildren after eventual release. During sentencing hearing, where victims had opportunity to make impact statements describing how Irene's crimes had affected their lives, Gabriel courageously presented articulate statement describing trauma of having been manipulated against own parents through false promises, forcibly separated from safe family environment based on artificially induced preferences, and especially abandoned at boarding school based on lies about parental death that had created deep emotional wounds taking years to completely heal through intensive therapy. The maturity and especially eloquence with which 14-year-old Gabriel described impacts of Irene's crimes visibly moved judge presiding over hearing, who praised his courage in publicly confronting person who had caused so much suffering. After conclusion of sentencing hearing where Irene formally received 15 years prison, our family could finally begin focusing completely on future, instead of remaining psychologically trapped in traumatic past, dominated by manipulations and abandonments orchestrated by person who should have protected grandchildren instead of cynically exploiting them for petty vindictive purposes. The following months were dedicated to consolidating therapeutic progress, reinforcing trust in family relationships through consistency and predictability, and especially celebrating resilience. Gabriel, Julia, and Raphael had demonstrated navigating complex trauma with appropriate support from competent professionals and loving family committed to their emotional well-being above any other consideration. 1 year after children's recovery from boarding school, we organized small family celebration marking symbolic anniversary of reunion, and especially recognizing substantial progress everyone had made individually and collectively during 12 months of intensive therapeutic work, open communication about feelings and concerns, and especially patient reconstruction of trust that had been systematically destroyed by Irene. Gabriel had become vocal advocate for reforms in family custody processes through volunteer work with organization dedicated to protecting children from parental alienation. Julia had developed impressive artistic portfolio processing trauma through creative expression, and Raphael had gradually recovered cheerful personality characteristic of him, before manipulation campaign began transforming peaceful family life into nightmare of forced separation and institutional abandonment. During family celebration, where we shared children's favorite meal and especially reflected on impossible journey from manipulation through abandonment to reunion and gradual recovery, Gabriel made profound observation about how traumatic experiences had paradoxically strengthened family by teaching us about importance of open communication, emotional vulnerability, and especially about human resilience when confronted with adversities seeming insurmountable but navigable with appropriate support and unconditional love. Julia added that although she'd never choose to experience again trauma caused by Irene's manipulations, she had learned valuable lessons about own strength and especially about how to transform suffering into creative advocacy, helping others who might be going through similar situations. Raphael simply observed he was happy being home with real family instead of alone at boarding school waiting for grandmother, who had lied about mommy and daddy's death, to fulfill empty promises about weekly visits that never materialized after first day of cruel abandonment. The simplicity of Raphael's statement captured essence of family recovery, where complexities of trauma, therapy, legal processes, and especially forgiveness eventually reduced to fundamental truth that children need security, stability, and especially unconditional love from consistently present parental figures, instead of manipulators who exploit developmental vulnerabilities for selfish, vindictive purposes disguised as concerns about child welfare. Did you like Camilla's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.